Hey guys, this is Dave, and I have the Moondrop Para 2. This is a planar magnetic headphone. It has an open back design. It's priced at $499. Of course, this is the follow-up to the original, and the original was actually only $350. So they have come up in price quite a bit. And I will tell you right up front, during this review process, my experience with the Para 2 has been a little bit of a mixed bag for me, because there are things about it that I do like a lot, and then there are some things that I'm not overly keen on. In any case, I have spent a lot of time comparing this with some other headphones roughly within this price range, and I've also been kind of trying it out with different amps, different sources and such, and I think I have a pretty good idea for where I feel this lands in terms of its overall performance. So as usual, we'll go over the contents of the box, we'll talk about specs, go over the design, fit, and comfort, and then we'll get into sound. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. So I don't have the case out on my desk here because it was just too big, but I will be sure and I'll have some B-roll with everything that's included in the box running in the background throughout the video. So of course you get the headphones. It also comes with these sheepskin pads. It also comes with this cable. And since the cable is a 4.4 cable, they've also included this little 4.4 to 3.5 adapter in case you don't have any devices with a 4.4 headphone output. And then they've also provided that little drawstring cable bag back there. And again, what's nice though is that you do get a pretty decent protective carrying case for the headphones, and the case has some of these foam cutouts that kind of follow the shape of the headphones, and it actually does a really good job of keeping the headphones in place and protected, so they don't really move around much inside the case whenever you're traveling. And it's also pretty compact and light as well, since the headphones themselves are, again, they're a little heavy, so it's nice that the case is pretty light. However, I'm not as enthusiastic about the cable, and I don't really know any other way to say it, but to me, it does feel just a little cheap, if I'm being perfectly honest. And again, it does have the 4.4 balance termination, which I do like, and it plugs into the headphones using the 3.5 plugs, which is good because if you have an extra cable, you can swap it out. Now, in regards to the actual headphones, let's quickly talk about the driver again. It has a 100 millimeter planar magnetic driver, and that driver has a sensitivity of 160 dBs and an impedance of 9 ohms. And I will talk more about drivability in the sound segment, but I want to go ahead and just talk about the build and the design of the Para 2, because while from an aesthetics perspective, I do like the stainless steel finish. I like the look of the holes in the headband and the grill on the outside of the ear cups, but from a build quality perspective, it just doesn't feel as robust, I guess, as you would think it would based on the way it looks. Not that I'm really worried about its structural integrity necessarily. It's built well enough. It just feels, I guess, a little flimsy. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with the 36 magnets, I think, and just the weight of the earphones versus the flexible nature of that thin steel headband. And I think these weigh around 500 grams, maybe a little bit more. Now, as far as comfort, it is pretty comfortable on my head, and I do feel like the suspension part of the headband does a pretty good job of of evenly distributing the weight. So comfort wasn't really a very big issue for me, and neither was the fit really. However, I did end up making a small modification to the headband, as you can see. And what I've done here is I've actually taken the little adjustment mechanism apart and then moved and resecured the bottom of the support headband underneath the adjustment mechanism instead of coming through the top. And that actually gave me a little more room for adjustment. You need the correct Torx bit. I think it's a T00 bit. So this is not how it came. And if you want to see the support headband and how it's installed out of the box, then I would suggest checking out the product page. In any case, this worked really great for me. And with the proper tools, it actually only takes about 5 minutes. Now, one last minor issue is fit stability. The clamp force it isn't as tight as I would prefer, and I don't move around much when I'm listening to music. However, when I did move, I didn't feel like it was as secure. So it was secure, but not as secure as I would have liked it to be. And of course, ultimately, that's going to depend on your head size. For me, it didn't seem to take much movement for these to shift around on my head. Not that I never really got to the point where I felt like it was actually going to fall off my head. Again, they just felt a little loose for my liking. And I will say the clamp force and tension was enough to ensure the pads were resting reasonably snug around my ears. But again, I wouldn't have minded if they were a little more snug. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to sound. Okay, let's go ahead and quickly talk about drivability. So again, this has a 9 ohm impedance and a sensitivity of 106 dB. So it's not going to require much in terms of power to drive these to pretty high volume levels. For example, the QX13 dongle drove these pretty well. I was able to reach pretty loud volume levels with this. I think it was around 31 out of 60 volume steps, and that wasn't high gain, but that was not in desktop mode. And I also got similar results with my M18i, the M15i, and I even tried the Ibasso Junior Macaron. And I've got a lot of these kinds of little dongles, and any of these will work just fine. Obviously, you're not going to be pushing them to their peak performance levels, but these will push them to pretty loud volume levels. And I think with the Stargate 2, I was at about 42 out of 60 volume steps. Now, as far as some other devices that I tested these with, I did use a very wide range of both portable and desktop devices, including the Ibasso DX340, the DX270 MK2, Hibi R6 Pro Max, the Onyx XM10 here, and then some of my desktop devices were the FIO K19, the Luxon X9, Xduo TA32, FIO K9 Pro ESS, and several others. Now, as far as the Para 2's overall sound presentation, to me, I would call this kind of fairly neutral, I guess, with maybe a little forwardness in the upper mid-range. It's not going to be as mid-forward as the original Para, so vocals have a little more energy in the original, and I don't know if I would call this relaxed necessarily in the upper mids, but it is more relaxed than the original. And I think there is also maybe some lower treble energy that when you combine that energy with the upper mid energy, that might be causing my attention to be pulled towards the top half of its tuning. But let's go ahead and break things down a little further. And of course, we'll start with the bass. So its bass presentation is pretty neutral sounding to me. And while I don't know if I would consider this to sound overly thin, I do think, for me, it does come across maybe as a little lean sounding. I do know that I would have preferred just a tad more bass energy. It does, however, have good extension, really good extension, good enough so that those sub-bass frequencies do seem to help fill everything out a little bit more. And overall, I do still feel like I'm getting the full bass frequency experience. I just wish it had a little more energy. Now, as far as the overall bass quality, so bass speed, the bass texture, bass impact, I have to say, I was a little shocked at how good this is, considering it's only $499. And I knew this was a good driver, but it did actually exceed my expectations. Again, as far as the overall bass quality, it's impressively fast. And the bass has a really nice visceral and physical kind of presentation that you don't typically hear at this price point. And it's also really well controlled coming out of the bass into the mids. So there wasn't really any perceivable bass bleed. However, I would have loved to hear maybe just a little more added body or weight in vocals and instruments. So that leanness does seem to carry over into the mids as well. Now, I would not say it comes at the expense of overall naturalness necessarily. It still sounds full enough, I guess, and it has enough weight, just enough so that vocals and instruments maintain their naturalness. It also has good mid-range clarity. So again, while it's not as vocal forward as the original Para, vocals do still cut through nicely. And I think I actually prefer the vocal presentation of this over the original Para. And again, I mentioned that added lower treble energy that I think is helping kind of to bring vocals out just a little more. Although with that extra treble energy, I guess you could say it might be adding a little bit of brightness to the top end, but I don't feel like it's coming across as harsh or overly edgy to my ears at least. And I actually thought this paired really nicely with my X Duo TA32 because it seemed to soften its presentation just a little bit, but without sacrificing much in the way of detail and overall technical performance. Now, of course, that's switching over from my FIO K19 here, which is obviously quite a bit more clinical than the tube presentation of the TA32. In any case, if you have both options, it may be worth your time comparing the two different presentations. Now, as far as treble balance overall, it is a little forward for me. So that does help as far as opening things up, and it does give it a pretty nice sense of space and a sense of detail, which I do like that. However, again, it also adds to the overall brightness of the signature. Now, as far as its technical performance, where I think the Para 2 really shines, and I would even say punches above its weight, is in its sheer detail and its resolution. And I was comparing this with quite a few other sets in this price range. And again, in terms of just sheer detail and clarity, the Para 2 consistently came out on top. Maybe the one exception being the HD 600, but in terms of detail levels, this is a pretty impressive set. The soundstage is good. I don't know that I would call it very wide, but I think it would be probably appropriate to say it's realistically wide and maybe even slightly above average width. It does, however, have really good instrument imaging and separation for this price point. So the rest of its overall technical capabilities are good, but I think what stood out to me about this was just how detailed it was. Now, as far as where I feel this stands among the competition from a technical standpoint, I don't know if this is the most technical headphone in its price range, but I feel like it punches above its weight, and I would even say it throws blows with some of the best within this price range. And the Aria Stealth here comes to mind because yes, the original price of the Aria Stealth was, I think, around $1,300 or $1,500. But if you look, you can find these for around, I think, $500 or $600. I've seen them priced at. So it's not too far-fetched to make the comparison between these two. And yes, the Stealth does have a more vocal forward and maybe even a semi-bright presentation. However, I still find it to be a little more natural sounding and maybe even a little more technical than the Para 2. And I will also throw in that if you can find an Aria Stealth at within that $500 to $600 price range, if you have the money, it's an absolute insane value in my opinion. I still use mine all the time and I absolutely love it. Now, compared with the Baroque, while I do find the Baroque to have it's very rich and it has a nice body to its presentation, it is lacking though somewhat in the top half of its presentation. So it kind of leans the opposite direction of the Para 2. So it's warm and relaxed versus the Para 2's brighter, more vocal forward presentation. And the Para 2 is without question going to be my headphone of choice between the two, because while I do occasionally, I like to hear something a little different, something with a little more body and more weight at times, but the Para 2 does come closer to my tuning preference and is going to be something that I'm more likely to reach for on a regular basis. Now, compared with the HD 600, which I don't actually have on hand, but I do have access to it almost at any time. It's my friend's HD 600. I think I preferred the vocal presentation of the HD 600 because while it is a little more vocal forward than I typically like, there's no denying that it does vocals very beautifully. And I think it might also one up the Para 2 in terms of detail levels. And again, that's another one of those, if you can find a good price, I think you can find them maybe around $300. That is absolutely a killer deal. Now, as for whether or not the Para 2 gets my recommendation, if you like a clean, natural mid-forward presentation with neutral bass and excellent detail and excellent vocal and instrument reproduction for this price point, this does all of that exceptionally well, and I can certainly recommend this set if you're looking for that. Again, even though it's maybe a little lean and bright, I did really get a ton of listening enjoyment out of this set. So that concludes my review of the Para 2. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you guys like Gazadio's content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you want to support us through our Patreon, I'll make sure and leave a link in the description for that. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Please like this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.